I remember when Gene Murphy, working for Republic Aviation at the time, arrived in Washington trying to alert Henry Kissinger as to what was going on and focusing on this very serious Angolan problem, the arrival of the Cubans, the infrastructure that the Soviets were setting up for the Cubans. And finally, we did focus on it, and it was Dick Walters, Vernon Walters, as a matter of fact, who went to Madrid for a secret meeting with General Vandenberg, who was then head of the South African Intelligence Service, how to organize this covert operation to try to prevent the Cubans from taking over. And as you know, it was stopped. It did indeed, first by the Tunney Amendment, which was very interesting. I think Senator Tunney, being rather naive, was totally manipulated in this operation. It was subsequently...
I told you, Lewis.
I
was for it, so I'm happy to defend it.
But the Tunney Amendment was replaced by the Clark Amendment in 1976, the following year. And the South African force arrived within 18 miles of Luanda when the Tunney Amendment was passed, yanking the rug right from under that operation and ensuring a communist victory. Correct, Bill, because there was a three-sided coalition that had been agreed to in January of 1975.
Yeah, which never materialized.
Actually, it did. They got into the same compound in Luanda, and then suddenly the compound was bombarded with a mortar barrage, and the whole thing fell apart.
Also, before we leave the Henry Kissinger's role entirely aside, we ought to acknowledge that in collaboration with Pompidou, it was agreed that the French would take an active role in Angola in ousting the Cubans, provided the United States was collaborative in this particular enterprise, which, of course, then they ran into the Tunney Amendment and were unable to do it.
The French actually went on, even under Giscard, right up until Mitterrand arrived in power in 1981. The French intelligence service, then under Alexandre Marange, was the only service supplying Savimbi with SAM-7s, which enabled him to shoot down those first Soviet planes, because I went down there at the time to interview the first two Soviet aviators who'd been shot down. And they were shot down with SAM-7s not supplied by South Africa, but by the French intelligence service.
Sure, why not be honest,
Tony, Jonas Savimbi is the first to tell you that he has indeed accepted South African aid. He denounces apartheid just as vehemently as you do.
I don't disagree with that.
And he is not an ally of apartheid. He's not an ally of P.W. Botha.
God is an ally of Portugal. He went all the way to Mao Zedong to learn how to fight.
He is no more grateful to South Africa for its aid than Joseph Stalin was grateful to us in World War II for Lend-Lease aid. It didn't mean that he was genuflecting in front of pluralistic democratic principles.
I'd like to raise this point. What causes us to suppose that the interests of the whites and the blacks in South Africa are different in respect of the colonization by a Soviet satellite of Angola? That is to say, why would it annoy any black South African who's interested in anti-colonial Prussia and interested in the restoration of freedom and justice and democracy to have his government cooperate with the United States against these tyrants, these Marxist tyrants? I don't think we really ought to be governed by an attempt to ingratiate ourselves with people who don't think very clearly. And we think much more clearly than the average Zulu or Xhosa on whether...
Come on, Bill, that's a racist remark.
No, it isn't.
Forgive my saying so.
It's a factual statement.
Yes, it is.
Now, wait a minute. In respect of
it
this
certainly
problem,
is.
I mean, Bishop Tutu, with all due respect, is not what I would call a geopolitician, is he?
No.
6 million blacks.
The notion that the cause is
down.
contaminated because South Africa is in favor of it is preposterous. The South African government is in favor of a lot of things that we're in favor of. For instance,
it's your pragmatic judgment that we should make an ally today of the government of South Africa?
No, but it has nothing to do with South Africa, Tony. It seems to me the case stands on its own
joint
merit.
enterprise.
It seems to me that it has nothing to do with South Africa. The Cuban troops are not there to protect Angola against South African incursions. They are there to protect the collapse of the MPLA Marxist-Leninist regime and to make sure that Jonas Savimbi does not win.
I don't agree with
That's why the Cubans... Well, I'm sorry, I spoke to 7 Cubans who had defected. 5 of them were working as scouts with Savimbi, and I made 4 trips behind the lines there. I know you've been to Luanda many times, but I think we have more freedom...
Once only.
Well, we have more freedom to report from Savimbi's side than you do from the Luanda side, as you well know. You were not allowed to wander around. You didn't go very far afield out of Rwanda, as I recall, except under escort. Well, those 7 Cubans, incidentally, before they left Havana, were told by their political commissars, they were proselytized, as they all are before they go to Africa, and they're told, our military presence, the Cuban military presence, will be in Africa until, quote, the liberation of Cape Town, quote, unquote. They're going for broke.
I'm still awaiting the answer. How are you going to do it? We've had a war going on there now for 10 years
Helping
with very
Savimbi.
active South African support, and the proposition is that we should replace South Africa as Savimbi's guarantor and aider. How
Why replace? There are 11 black African countries today helping Savimbi.
You want to be it because that...
They've been gaining time with this alleged timetable for a Cuban withdrawal, just as the Soviet Union occasionally drops hints about a withdrawal from Afghanistan, and I'm sure you would concede that the Soviet Union has no intention of getting out of Afghanistan.
I want freedoms are taught. To get back to your point, if SWAPO, for instance, is serious, as I assume that they are serious, they want to oust the South Africans from Namibia simply in order to take it over. And they are ideological brethren of the people who are running Angola. And this surely is what is our strategic responsibility to keep our eyes on. Much though we desire and should desire chain reforms in South Africa, that we shouldn't be dominated as hypnotically as you evidently are by the fact that there is a tyranny existence in South Africa against the fact that there's a tyranny in Angola.
Oliver Tambo of the ANC, as you know, Tony, and Sam Nujoma of SWAPO and Fidel Castro met in September of '84 in Havana, and as Bill just said, they are fairly close and roughly on the same ideological wavelength.
That's certainly not true of Tambo. Tambo is not on their ideological wavelength. He takes aid where he can get it, and he hasn't been able to get it. He gets a lot of aid from European countries, but not arms.
That's
he gets
true.
arms
Savimbi.
from
Savimbi gets aid from
Savimbi.
11 African countries, from Saudi Arabia, even from Thailand, of all places, and it does all, as you said earlier, funnel through Namibia, which is occupied by South Africa today. But that doesn't seem to inhibit Saudi Arabia from helping Jonas Savimbi.
For its reasons. It was going to make other quagmires look like a picnic.
You know, it's low-risk, low-intensity warfare, Tony, in which U.S. troops will definitely not be involved. We're talking about a minuscule amount of money. We're talking about anything from $15 to $50 million. He could do an awful lot with that. Look at what he's done without our aid up until now. He's been gaining ground all the time. There was, as you said yourself, some South African assistance in that famous offensive a few weeks ago.
Gaining ground, he was saved from destruction by South African intervention last year.
I'm sorry, there was a hell of a battle in which UNITA troops lost about 2,000 of their own people.
Oh, I say, he was fighting, but he has himself said that the South Africans made the difference.
That's absolutely. And why shouldn't South Africa make the difference? You would take help from wherever you can get it if you're fighting for the freedom of your country.
Suppose we do give 50 or 100 or 200 or 300 million dollars to Savimbi, and suppose he does not prevail. I would deeply regret it, but I would consider it money well and honorably spent in the cause of attempting to answer back this irradiation of communist imperialism everywhere in the world.
You see, Tony,
I think that's our responsibility.
Where we probably agree is that we're not against revolutions per se. You seem to think that conservatives are against revolutions. What we're against is the hijacking of a revolution by a tiny minority of Marxists who then proceed to impose a more draconian form of dictatorship than the one they overthrew. And Angola today, I don't know, maybe you were taken on a guided tour and you didn't see the empty shelves and all of that, but it's extraordinary that Marxism is a total failure everywhere. It is only kept in power by Soviet weaponry. The Soviets have shipped about $2 billion worth of weapons to Angola in 18 months, including MiG-23s, MiG-21s, Mi-24 helicopters, Mi-8 helicopter troop carriers, and so on and so forth. And we should just sit back and do nothing. And half the ANC leadership are also members of the South African Communist Party. You can't deny that, Tony.
No.
One man, one vote.
Oh, well,
I'm
sorry. I saw P.W. Botha about a year ago, and he said, I'm watching all of Black Africa dying in front of my eyes, and one man, one vote will take place over my dead body. Maybe it will be over his dead body.
And would happen once.
But can you imagine one man, one vote, one time situation in South Africa until one dictator from the ANC claws his way to the top of the heap, which is what we've seen all over Africa?
The notion that we should really determine policy on the basis of fearing to alienate the South Africans. Alienate them towards what?
But alienate
towards the
who?
Soviet Union? If indeed we are dealing with people who would prefer to be run by the Soviet Union than to struggle in their own way for a decent kind of liberty with justice, then we're dealing with a lost cause there, aren't we?
Let me trust traction in southern Africa. The whole region today is the existence of the apartheid regime in South Africa. It's the fact of a white minority government that calls itself Western, quote unquote, that says it's part of the Western world, though I think its ideology is very different. That gives communism its biggest appeal. I think in purely geopolitical terms, our fondest hope should be that government were replaced by
I
a
think
democratic
that's
one.
utter nonsense, and I'll tell you why. Because you are either dealing with people who think or who don't think. If you deal with people who don't think, then you simply don't know how to manipulate their thought. If you're dealing with people who think, then they're going to ask themselves, what kind of life do the Soviet Union preside over? Now, the OAS elected Idi Amin as its president, and they had huge testimonial demonstrating. Excuse me?
The OAU.
The OAU.
And it didn't elect him.
Here.
He took it in rotation. It was Uganda's turn, and he happened to be the dictator of Uganda at the time.
And Gaddafi sent 3,000 troops down there to help him.
Three out of 45 countries.
Wasn't good, I don't mean to say that, but they didn't elect him.
Here's my point is very simply this, that for us all of a sudden become apologetic about an attempt to help freedom fighters in Angola on the grounds that we therefore alienate people who, however, are not alienated by Gulag, are not alienated by Uganda, are not alienated by Idi Amin, to me is preposterous.
I would go further, Bill, and I'd like to ask Tony this question. How come the American media in its entirety overlooked the longest-running horror story in all of Africa, which was ex-French Guinea, taken over by Sékou Touré in 1958, establishing Africa's first Marxist-Leninist state, which incidentally is no longer Marxist-Leninist since Sékou Touré died 2 years ago. The French press has covered the hell out of this story. Nothing in our press about this gigantic torture chamber called Guinea, which lasted a quarter of a century.
He got an honorary degree 3 years ago down in Georgia.
So, I mean,
for a moment, I thought you were going to say Yale, but I was...
Well, I wouldn't be all that surprised.
Isn't this the Leninist regime in Nicaragua? Why aren't you just as upset about that?
Angola? Or
no, Afghanistan's a long way away.
We're discussing this popular superstition in American imagination, and that is that by being super sensitive to all of the inclinations of the third world, we are making sound policy. I say being super sensitive to all the inclinations of the world tends to prevent us from making sound policy, as witness that the politics and the democracy and freedom in Africa is deteriorating year after year after year as a result of our particular form of patronizing. And therefore, to worry about alienation as a decisive factor that prevents us from helping freedom fighters in Angola is self-defeating.
This country, from the time of George Washington through the Adamses, through most of our history, has been dedicated to what John Quincy Adams said, that the United States will help its friends abroad best by being true to itself and by keeping the lamp of liberty alight at home, not by becoming engaged in foreign wars. And all of a sudden we have conservatives who want to get into a quagmire in Angola, in every other place.
If you followed the advice of John Quincy Adams, you would not permit any government action by the United States against South Africa. The Americans, said John Quincy Adams, are friends of liberty everywhere, but custodians only of their own. Or as Senator Fulbright put it, the United States government has no proper quarrel with any country, no matter how hideous its domestic policy, so long as it does not seek to export to qualify. But we're talking about a country that does seek to exploit its hideousness.
South Africa.
No.
Oh, yes, it's invaded every country around it in the last few years. How about that for exporting violence?
I'm not aware that they have a square inch of territory they didn't have 50 years ago.
They did sign an
yes,
agreement.
they occupy considerable parts of Angola at this very moment.
No, not considerable parts. They've made incursions. Come on.
They haven't said
They've had forces there more or less continuously for the last 5 years, with a few weeks exception.
They haven't annexed it in the sense that Israel, say, has annexed the Golan Heights.
Oh, I grant you that. They haven't annexed it, okay?
Okay.
But we have a rightful concern about the destabilizing effect of South African military
don't get away
policy.
with what you said. They were trying to export apartheid. I don't see that.
Oh, no, I don't say they're trying. They're trying to protect apartheid
That's
at home by destabilizing everybody around them.
And what happened as a result on March 11th, 1984, Mozambique, a Marxist state, signed a peace treaty with South Africa, which Mozambique has respected, and South Africa too.
South Africa, too. To the
Yes.
contrary, the South African government has admitted violating it.
Well, some people have apparently done a little freelancing, helping
Little
Renamo, etc., but the government policy is to respect the Nkomati Accords.
It may be
And
the policy, but they're not
South Africans
respected.
are going in and out of Mozambique today. They even spend weekends on the beaches of Maputo today.
Because, a lot of equipment was found, flown in by South Africa after the accord. Landing strip built and everything after the accord.
Pre-positioned. I was there at the time. They
but-
pre-positioned equipment for the next 2 years, as they have in Angola.
Pre-positioned.
6 anti-communist national liberation fronts around the world. Who knows? There may be 9 or 10.
No, I was talking about Czechoslovakia.
Yes, I know.
About
But it seems to me we're talking about low-intensity, low-risk warfare with tremendously high geopolitical payoff.
Are you
when
in
and
favor
if
of
it
helping
succeeds.
Afghanistan?
Am I?
The freedom fighters in Afghanistan?
Yes, I am.
You are?
Yes,
Well,
as we have been doing, covertly.
Doesn't that risk atomic war?
No, I was talking about Czechoslovakia.
I know,
it
but
doesn't.
now I'm talking about Afghanistan.
No, it
If
doesn't.
the
Obviously
Soviet
not.
Union declares that it is a cause militant to occupy Afghanistan, are you or are you not in favor of opposing that?
Soviet Union hasn't declared that and won't because it cannot effectively do so. Soviet Union walked boldly and brutally into a peaceful country and occupied it.
6
It was
months after we signed the
outrageous.
SALT II treaty.
It was an outrageous act which we can never accept. And
But how do you explain that there are no demonstrations against this outrageous act anywhere in the Western world today, but we have demonstrations against the South African embassy every evening at 6
And what
o'clock?
makes you think we can help win the war in Afghanistan against a country of 250 million people? Why are you idealistic there but not idealistic in the matter of Angola?
because I think that the policy you favor in Angola, far from being idealistic, is mad. It isn't going to achieve anything. It is not going to put Mr. Savimbi in power. It is going to embroil the United States in a no-win war that, I repeat, will make Vietnam look easy and will bring us only trouble and enemies and not achieve what you want to achieve.
In other words, something
It's
right on the
simply
Soviet
crazy.
Union's borders called Afghanistan, where you could argue from the Soviet viewpoint that there are legitimate Soviet security interests at stake. There we should challenge them. But in Angola, where you have 35,000 Cuban mercenaries, we shouldn't do a damn thing. Just mind our own business. It doesn't add up, Tony.